This is Weights and Wealth, your one-stop shop for entertaining education on building a stronger body and bank account.
We are not doctors or financial advisors and must warn you this is not medical or investing advice. It is for your entertainment. Welcome back to another episode of Weights and Wealth. This will be the episode that's coming out July 3rd, so we figured that freedom would be the best topic to cover in this episode.
Yeah, it's our 4th of July episode.
It is, yes. And you also may notice that we don't have headphones on right now. We were having some technical difficulties, so we'll see how it goes without being in podcast mode with our headphones on. And so, Ted, who is the shout out for this week?
The shout out for this episode goes to all of my groomsmen from the wedding. This episode will be coming out right after Alex and I get married. So Alex and I will be away on our honeymoon. So any questions you have about this episode, we'll have to go to Nick through the Instagram. But shout out goes to all my wonderful groomsmen, guys I can really count on, men of great character. So thank you guys.
Who's the best man again?
Nick.
That's me. Oh, yeah. That's right. Now we have our weights wisdom for the week.
Our weights wisdom is do cardio to make long sets less cardio. So if you're someone that never does cardio and you really struggle to make it through a high rep set of squats or really any movement, if cardio is an issue for you on those higher rep sets, you should probably start throwing in some cardio, just so that that's not the limiting factor for you. Cardio also does have some health benefits, but if you're not able to make it through like a long set, that probably means that your cardio is not in a very good spot and you should work on improving it. So
yeah, and this is not to be confused with cardio with weights, as we've talked about before.
Yes, do your cardio separate day or a separate time, but just slowly start to increase that capacity. So
yeah, okay. And then this week, or this episode's intro article, the title is "Cancer Rates Are Climbing Among Young People. It's Not Clear Why." And this kind of relates to the topic of our podcast a little bit. Just because, so we are doing, I'm sure many of you have seen this video before, but it was a KGB defector who went to Canada and then came to the US, and he did this interview in, I think, 1986, basically about how the Soviets tried to infiltrate America through mainly the education system. And he talked a lot about how it doesn't matter how much evidence is given to you, that people won't be able to come to sensible conclusions after they have been run through these essentially 4 different stages. And I mean, at least to me, it's kind of clear why cancer rates are rising. It's because people are living completely different than how people evolved to live. You know, we're spending most of our time inside, sitting down, and how people evolved, like people are supposed to be moving around and like working, like physically.
Yeah, also the amount of chemicals that we're exposed to on a daily basis. Like, have you ever seen the little infographics about how many chemicals a woman is exposed to every day just from her hair and makeup products? It's like 100 something. It's crazy. All these different chemicals that are toxic in different doses to our body. But when you're repeatedly exposing yourself to that, even just from like the microplastic exposure that people have, all of these things are, I mean, if you're stressing your liver and your body, it makes sense why cancer would probably increase. But I think the article was saying we still haven't been able to pin down one specific cause for the increase of cancer.
Right. And I think that's something people want. People kind of want to know that X causes Y.
Yeah.
But it's usually A plus B plus C plus D plus E, and like so on. Like there are many
myriad
factors.
of things that make up your lifestyle. It's not just one thing. It's like, I mean, it's just like with fitness, people are always looking for the magic bullet that will help them lose weight. And it's like, when I coach someone, I don't just give them a magic bullet. There's a variety of things that we do, because it does wind up being a lifestyle approach that's often the best and gives people the best results.
Yeah. And this is also why when I go to the doctor, I usually go to a holistic doctor, because they tend to look at your entire life and not just one part of your life.
And going off of the environmental toxins and everything like that, Nick and I are both hoping that we can vote for a certain presidential candidate. So it would be, I don't know, Nick and I think typically vote for Republican or conservative candidates, but we're both looking to vote for RFK if he can get the Democratic nomination. So
Yeah, which, I mean, usually the incumbent is the one that gets the nomination again, but given our current president, this could be an outlier, I think.
it would be shocking if the Democrats run Biden just based off how unpopular and, I mean, really, like, it doesn't seem like he has a full grasp on everything that's going on. But, I mean, they ran him, 3 years ago? So they might do it again. They already said that Biden's not going to debate RFK or anyone else. So, and then also, you have to keep in mind with the Democratic primary, it's a lot different than the Republican primary where the voters get to choose. In the Democratic primary,
it's the DNC.
The DNC pretty much chooses. It's not really the people. So
and I mean, one of the things I like about RFK is, I mean, he's not only a really, really smart guy, but he's extremely knowledgeable too. I mean, like, his life's work has been basically looking at environmental toxins. So I think, I kind of think like the biggest problem facing America right now is just the state of our health.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
And so I think he would be someone who's great to switch that around. And I saw something, I think it was on Instagram. It was a clip from Joe Rogan's podcast with Bill Burr. And Bill Burr was kind of like, Joe, I'm not going to talk about vaccines with you because you don't have a medical degree. I don't either. RFK doesn't, but he knows how to read studies. And that's something that doctors aren't trained to do. Like, doctors are trained to understand how the body should work, but you don't really know until you test something. And RFK knows how to read these studies and interpret the results. Whereas doctors, they can come up with some new medication that they think should work, and there's a good chance that it will, but you really don't know until it's actually tested. And they aren't trained to really, from medical school, interpret results. I mean, I think I've talked about it before. I've been through, I looked through the Johns Hopkins medical school curriculum, and I think they take 1 or 2 classes on statistics, and you really need a much deeper knowledge to interpret like research studies that use statistical models.
Yeah. Also, RFK said during the Joe Rogan podcast that he was on that when you are suing these giant corporations, you earn a PhD in that topic. And he's been suing these big like corporations for environmental lawsuits for decades. And a lot of those have been with mercury as well. And so he has basically like a PhD in how mercury affects people. And he knows all the studies on how mercury affects people and how ethyl and methyl mercury are excreted from the body or how they stay in the body. So I feel like he has a much better grasp on that than a lot of other people do. But just because he's not a doctor, they think that they can't listen to him, which I think is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people place a lot of emphasis on like the institutional learning, whereas I don't know. I think people who want to learn things will learn much better outside the classroom. I mean, like there's like the saying that the best student will learn. I'm going to mess up the saying,
all right.
but basically I think somebody at an average school who has a big desire to actually learn will do better than just like an average student at Harvard because they want to learn. Whereas somebody who's just kind of going through the motions, like, yeah, Harvard's a great school and you will learn a lot, but somebody who really has that desire to keep bettering themselves and learn more about the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. And then as far as like, aside from just the environmental reasons or the health reasons that we both like RFK, for me, this election that's coming up comes down to like 3 main issues. And that's getting out of wars, which the current president hasn't done as well as maybe some people that voted for him thought he would do. And then the other one is reducing our national spending. And on the All In podcast, when they had RFK on, he talked about how he sees a need to reduce the government spending as well. And then the third one is America's state of health. So I think RFK would be good for all 3 of those. And that's one of the reasons I'd vote for him. But I don't know. We might not get that opportunity. In which case, I think Nick and I will both probably vote third party.
Yeah.
So
I mean, we might have to wait another 4 years, or I guess at this point, what would it be, like 5 or 6? But
yeah,
I'm sure he will run once Biden is done.
yeah, probably.
So,
all right, moving on to the Yuri Bezmenov interview that Nick mentioned. You can find this interview on YouTube. It's only about 13 minutes long from 1984, funny enough. But essentially, Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB agent, as Nick said, that defected to Canada in 1970. And then in this interview in 1984, he kind of outlined the KGB model for how to brainwash the U.S. And he said that, what was the statistic? Yeah, he said only 15% of the KGB's time and money is spent on espionage, which people would think is like 100% of their job. He said only 15% of the time and money are spent on espionage, and the other 85% is spent on ideological subversion of their enemies. So they really try to influence abroad, other countries, their enemies, how the people in that country think. And I feel like you can see these mind viruses that have just kind of corrupted America over the past few decades.
Yeah, and he talks a lot about like critical thought, how they basically tried to expunge critical thought from the generations that were being educated. And he gives like examples where like you could show somebody that black is black and white is white, but they won't believe you.
2 + 2 = 5. Nick.
Yeah, it is. But I don't know. It really makes you think that like what have you believed for so long that just might not be true just because you've been told it over and over and over and over and over. And I think it's a little naive to think that, you know, you yourself aren't subject to something like that.
Yeah, the first time I really got a grasp of this concept was when I watched something that Dinesh D'Souza put together, where he went through like the history of the 20th century and how if you tell a lie enough times, no matter how big and ridiculous it is, people will believe it. And he went through like the example with Nazi Germany, and I think his name was Goebbels, the main propaganda guy for Hitler, how if you just tell people the same lie enough times, they'll start to believe it. And you can see this on a micro level when people lie to themselves kind of over and over again, and they can like change their memories just by lying to themselves and just keeping it going in their head. They can change what their memory of an event was.
Right. And stuff like that, it doesn't really take that long. I mean, like I've heard stories of people making false confessions to a crime, but they actually believe it.
Yeah.
If you hear something like that for like, you know, even just like 2 days straight, you can actually be convinced that you did something that you didn't do.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why like stuff like that can be thrown out in court, a confession.
And it really doesn't take long for people to change their mind on what the reality of the situation is. We saw this very recently. We harp on COVID a lot, but it's a really interesting microcosm of human behavior, right? So like when the vaccines first came out, 100% safe and effective, right? They kept parroting that. And then 96%, 90%, 80%, 70%. Like I have this video on my phone of just this compilation of it just keeps going down in all these articles and news clips. But then they said, "Oh no, we didn't say that," and they just kept saying that they didn't say
gaslighting.
It. Yeah. But then people were like, "Oh no, they never said that." It's like, yes, they did say that. They said you won't be able to transmit COVID if you get the vaccine, and then they said they didn't say that, but they did say that. So it's just kind of crazy that people's memories will change based off just hearing a lie over and over again.
Yeah, and like you would think after the first lie or two, people could kind of come to conclusions and be like, oh, maybe they aren't telling the truth now. But it didn't seem like that really happened on like the macro scale.
Yeah, so if we get into more of the interview here, we can see how that happens. And the first stage that Yuri Bezmenov introduced, he said it takes about 15 to 20 years typically, and it's demoralization. So when you demoralize the people, you're able to get them to change their mind because they're not sticking to their principles as much, right?
Yeah, and also, I mean, kids are extremely malleable. Like, kids are very trusting and will believe what somebody of authority has to say much more so than, you know, somebody who's already been stuck in their ways for 50 years. And one of the things that he talked about was talking about Marxism and Leninism in schools, which, I mean, I personally, especially at like a high school, college level, I don't really have a problem with that as long as it's balanced out with other ideas, because that's how you kind of figure out like the best systems. And when they teach or when they were trying to teach like Marxism, like they wouldn't balance it out with like traditional like capitalism or American values.
Yeah, whenever in high school they would teach the different systems of government, the goal that they would always say of like communism, socialism was to get equality for everyone, have everyone be successful and no poor people. And then the goal that they would always say of capitalism was to make a lot of money and develop like very few
rich.
super rich people. It's like, okay, that's not really the goal of capitalism. The goal of capitalism is to have the free market lift all boats with a rising tide, right? So everyone gets a higher standard of living as the market impacts everyone beneficially. Some people are impacted less beneficially, but still everyone's coming up. Whereas socialism, it's like a lowering tide. It's like getting a lock on a canal and it just starts sinking.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
But they don't balance that perspective. They just show the good of one and the bad of the other, I feel, and at least in my history classes in high school. So I was always pushing back on the teachers in high school.
Oh yeah. And like one of the things I love about capitalism is that it encourages freedom. I mean, like you can have two people who have their own selfish interests, and then when put together, they can work together for a mutually desired goal if they share a common goal. Whereas, you know, if you're doing essentially forced labor, which is what happens under communism, like you're given a job, which is also why like during like the Soviet Union, they could tout a 0% unemployment rate. But my question is, was that work all productive? Was it all productive work? It doesn't really matter if everybody's working, if everybody's just digging a hole and filling it back up again. Like that doesn't produce anything of value. Whereas, you know, if people can like choose how to spend their money, choose how to spend their time, they can kind of determine the market, and things that people actually value and want will come to be.
And the other thing with demoralization that Bezmenov was saying is that when people's morals are kind of stripped away that they rely on, then they stop being sure of certain things, and then everything is kind of subjective. So then you see it now. Bezmenov didn't highlight it in the interview, but now you see this postmodern thought that happens on a lot of college campuses that was started over in France. And Jordan Peterson talks about it a lot because it's especially made its way into like the humanistic studies. But it's basically like everything is questionable and like reality doesn't really exist, right? That's how you get to what is a woman. Like, there's no real truths in the universe anymore. And when it all starts at the beginning with demoralization and just stripping things away one at a time, how freedom is not good. When they take God out of schools, right? Just slowly, one by one, taking down these pillars of morals that the country used to stand on. Once they start taking those away, everything just becomes subjective. People don't have things in common anymore. Everything becomes very questionable. And then you can easily start to convince people of certain things much more easily. Yeah.
Another thing he mentioned is that they wanted to program people essentially how to think and react to things. And I mean, just think about like your daily life. Most of what you do isn't conscious. I'm pretty sure it's like around 10-15%. I could be off with these. I'm pretty sure it's less than half though of your actions are actually, you actually do things because of conscious thought. Most of it is just habit and instinct. Like
autopilot.
That's why autopilot, right? That's why you can get into a car and then just all of a sudden you just kind of wake up and like you're at your destination.
Nick, I'm not sure I want you driving anymore, Nick.
No, but you could be like, I don't actually really remember too much about driving here. It's all, well, because by now I've been driving for 9 years. It's just kind of instinct now. You know, I see a red light, I stop. I see a green light, I go. I see a blinker, another person's moving over. And like, I don't really have to consciously think about it just because I've been doing it for so long. And it's just like habit now.
Yeah, multitasking usually doesn't work for people, right? But if you're so used to a certain activity, you can listen to a podcast while you drive and it doesn't really impact your driving, right? For me, it impacts, I like miss turns if I'm supposed to be looking at a map. But if I know like where I'm going, just like if I'm going to the grocery store and I know the route, it doesn't affect me. Yeah. So it's something you've done over and over and over again. Yeah.
And yeah, same with that work. Like when I'm doing taxes, I see a lot of the same things over and over and over, which is why I can sometimes listen to a podcast just because what I'm doing now it's almost second nature.
Yeah. Jobs when you can listen to a podcast while you're
great.
working are key. Imagine listening to Weights and Wealth while working. Yeah.
Wink, wink. But this can also go the other way. I mean, I think we've generally kind of talked about positive things, but you can be, programmed to, or I mean, you do have control over your own, what we'll call programming, because you can implement good habits, but you can have people who also implement bad habits in you and have you react poorly to certain stimuli. And that's basically what they were trying to do.
Yeah. Should we move on to stage 2?
Sure.
So stage 2, the first stage was demoralization, 15 to 20 years, he said it usually takes. Stage 2 is destabilization, and that usually takes 2 to 5 years, he said. And so this is essentially after demoralization, when you're taking a whole generation, raising them through school all the way up and demoralizing them, making it really easy to kind of subvert their reality and just kind of instill whatever truth, quote unquote, you want in them. Then you can go for destabilization, and you can allow this new generation to take over. You see this with pretty much every communist upheaval, right? So if you want to use China for the example, with Mao, the Cultural Revolution, right? All these young students started to basically attack the older generation, and they got rid of all the older generation's doctors and lawyers and everything. And then it led to chaos, basically, because everyone that had experience in jobs wasn't allowed to do that job anymore. But once you demoralize that younger generation, then you can destabilize that civilization or that community.
And yeah, he mentioned three areas that they really target. It's the economy, foreign relations, and then also the army or defense system. So I guess we can start with the economy. I mean, we both have talked about the gold standard, and I don't really know enough about real macroeconomics to talk extremely intelligently on it, but we can at least see a correlation between buying power and when the U.S. went off the gold standard in the 70s, right?
Yeah, so when we were doing some research for this episode, as far as how the economy shifted when we got off the gold standard, we started to come... Whoa! We're back. We started to come across a bunch of graphs that showed the correlation of buying power and other statistics as far as the economy and working that happened when we got off the gold standard. And there's a really clear inflection point for a lot of those statistics. So we're going to be doing a whole episode just on that and the correlation of what happened after we got off the gold standard. So we'll go into this more in that one. But
yeah, because also in the 80s we saw a lot of inflation, and we're going to be in that episode. We'll be talking about inflation, but also deflation as well, because that's been seen a few times. It's not very common, and there are good and bad things about it. It also matters why things happen.
I feel like every time.
Sorry.
I feel like every time we go through an outlier example for macroeconomics, it's always Japan.
It is, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about Japan is they have a declining population. I think theirs is declining faster than
anyone else, pretty much. Yeah.
So they're experiencing these weird economic things because that doesn't that rarely happens, that a population starts to decline.
Yeah.
But yeah, that happened to them back in the 90s. They had a housing bubble, very similar to what happened to us in 2008. I think we experienced a little bit of deflation in 2009 as a result.
But back to this for the economy. If you can destabilize the economy, that leads to a lot of destabilization throughout, right? Because if people, when people lose their jobs, that's a huge event in people's lives. That I mean, they lose their buying power, they lose their security, right? Most people's main security is money and having a job, right? Because then they can't. If you don't have a job, you can't really feed your family, right? So if you're able to impact the economy and make it so that either things are a lot more expensive, or so that the markets aren't working properly, or so that people are losing their jobs, whether it's inflation or unemployment, really, the economy has a big effect on people's lives.
Right. Yeah. And when economics or when the economy is uncertain, people kind of get fearful. When people are fearful, they tend to not act rationally.
Yeah. Never waste a crisis, right?
Right. Yeah.
So if you're trying to destabilize your enemy, I mean, that's like one of the Green Berets ways. They use like psychological, but then they also try to manipulate like the economy if they're in a smaller country, or the CIA, right? Like that's what they do. So this isn't just like a Russian KGB thing trying to subvert your enemy's economy. That's America does it as well abroad.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, like kind of the old way of fighting wars was, like swords and then muskets. And now I feel like it's kind of all like psychological. Like that is I mean, in my opinion, that would be a much better way to take down a country than to go in guns blazing, especially with like the present day world where, there's a lot of communication and everybody kind of knows what's happening in all countries. If you just go in and attack a country, you're going to face resistance from across the world.
Yeah. It's easier to just Trojan horse blatant. Over a long period of time.
Right. Yeah. And it's much more like it's harder to tell that somebody's actually doing something if it's more secretive.
Yeah. And like Nick said, how the economy destabilized people, that makes them fearful. Whenever people are more fearful, it allows for like a big change, right? Because if people are really fearful, they want change, and then you can make a big change and make it the population's idea, right? So if you're looking to drastically change a country from within, a really good way to do that is to destroy or hamper their economy.
Yeah, and I mean when like Ted said, when people are fearful, they want change. Like, I mean, whether this is good or bad, I don't really know because I didn't live pre 9/11. But right after 9/11, you saw TSA security get a lot more stringent, right? I mean, I didn't fly before then, but from what I've read, it used to be much more lackadaisical in airports with security, and I don't know. I mean, it could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. I don't really know.
Makes your plane ticket a little more expensive.
It does. Yeah, more
planes aren't falling out of the sky as much. I think that's a good thing. So
yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know. Just an example. I don't really have an opinion on it.
Moving on to foreign relations. So if you look at pretty much ever since the 90s, the U.S. has constantly been involved in international conflicts, pretty much on it, like without stop, right? So, Nick, did you have anything specific for foreign relations from the Yuri Bezmenov interview?
I mean, not really. I mean, the most recent one and public one has been Ukraine. I mean, I haven't been following it very closely, but from what I've read, it's not really what it seems, what the media portrays it to be. So I don't really know what's happening there. I don't know. Do you have anything to add about?
It's just
you know more than I do on this, but you're limited. And
I mean, it is interesting how much money we've sent. You could almost tie foreign relations into economy because of the amount of money that we've sent over to Ukraine. It's like, okay, we don't have this money to fix up inner cities, but when Ukraine needs the money, we can send it over to them.
Yeah.
It's very, very sus, as the kids would say.
I think it's a little... I think people have a little bit too much trust, especially of foreign countries, and they can kind of use that money however they want. Yeah.
It's the whole 2014 New York Times article saying Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world. And then Candace Owens highlighted this. Candace Owens then was saying how corrupt Ukraine was when the whole Ukraine-Russia thing really got started into war. Was that over a year ago now?
It's been going on for a good bit.
And then the New York Times started attacking her. Why are you saying that? And then she just like tweeted their 2014 article.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, especially the people in power, they could be pocketing a good amount of that money. Yeah. I mean, it just has to be a very, very, very small percentage. Because I mean, we've sent them billions and billions and billions of dollars, right?
The Pentagon accidentally sent them an extra like $6 billion the other day, and they're like, "Oh, it was an accounting error."
And when you're sending that much money, $6 billion can be an accounting.
And then they're like,
error.
"We're not going to ask for it back. We'll just take it out of the next payment we send them." It's
and I mean, if you're an official receiving that money over there, and you can just easily skim a cool $50 million off the top, and nobody will notice,
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that's happening. I don't know, but I'm just thinking as somebody could, or of what somebody could potentially do.
Yeah. And then the third prong of what Yuri Bezmenov said that they'll target with the destabilization phase is the defense system.
Yeah.
And if we look at America, I would say our defense system has definitely been destabilized over the course of the last 40 years.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like at least recently they have largely been marketing towards people who wouldn't join the army, which doesn't make any sense from a recruiting standpoint. Like I know I think it was the Navy had a drag queen recruiter, and you're the typical person who joins the army is some kid right out of high school.
This is the Navy, though, Nick.
It is the Navy. But somebody that wants to join the military out of high school usually isn't in that crowd.
Yeah.
They tend to be a little bit more traditional, conservative. And so I think having stuff like that pushes your main recruiting base away. And the people who that is kind of pandering towards, like they probably, I mean, I'm sure the drag community makes up a very, 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 very small percentage of the army.
Yeah. And the Army and like the Department of Defense as a whole, really, not the Army specifically, but the DOD pushed the vaccine mandate, and they didn't have to do that, but they decided to go through with it anyway, and they kicked out a lot of soldiers. And I mean, I know a lot of people that were impacted by this issue, and the Army doesn't want, or the DOD doesn't want to admit that they messed up on this, but they did, and they pushed away a lot of people. And I think part of the recruiting issue they're having now is related to this, because like you said, the population they typically are going to pull from was very put off by that move, and they see that maybe they don't want to join because the DOD is pushing stuff like that. So it really comes from like a cultural thing at the top, and I feel like that's kind of degraded over the past couple of decades, and got no one to blame but yourself, I guess, when that happens.
Yeah, and I mean, again, just kind of postulating here, I mean, if you are at like the top of the military, you want people below you that will listen to you no matter what, whether you're right or wrong. You know, you want people who will be subordinate and do whatever you say. And I mean, whether they intended this or not, I mean, requiring the COVID vaccine pushed a lot of people out who wouldn't just listen to that order, because I mean, a lot of people were kicked out because they wouldn't get a vaccine.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And I mean, DOD can do what they want to do, but it just didn't seem like a very smart move.
No,
and they could have stopped any time, and they just went through with it all the way. So I don't know, but I think the bigger thing here than the cultural diversity, equity, inclusion things that they're pushing, or the vaccine or anything like that, is that the Army can't find people because most people aren't eligible to join the Army now, just because of either the combination of obesity and drugs and like illiteracy. Like, I think the letter that we went over from that general that was like a public statement just to the people of America was that he said that like 77% or something like that of current like high school teenagers are ineligible to join the Army. That's a way bigger security issue for our national defense than the Army shooting itself in the foot with its recruiting campaigns.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I mean, this is another reason why, because I mean, health impacts so many aspects of not just your life, but like the life of people around you. And if people aren't healthy enough to join the Army, that's going to weaken a country. Just like the economy can't function as well if people aren't as healthy because they don't have as much energy and they're not as productive.
Yeah. So if you're trying to subvert someone's national defense, make all their people just fat and sick and
unable to fight.
Yeah. It's a pretty good strategy. And it's whether or not the reason that we've gone down this road is directly responsible to the KGB, like it has happened.
It's
right. So
it's where we are now.
And that's like stuff like that is why people reference this interview and just are struck by it so deeply, is because almost everything that Yuri Bezmenov said in this interview just about 40 years ago has like come true, or like has basically happened. So it's like either the KGB was really successful or for some reason we did this to ourselves. But either way, it's like the prophecy that he had came true, even though it wasn't as much of a prophecy as much of like, this is how the KGB will do it if they're trying to attack their enemy in this way. So, and I mean, this was the height of the Cold War. He left the KGB in 1970 and did this interview in 1984, right? So
yeah, and I mean, and then at the end, he kind of posed like a question to himself, like, what's in this for me? Because, you know, people could be like, oh, he's just lying about it. Like, there's no point. Well, I mean, he was an American then. Like, he was living here. This was where he was a refugee, essentially. And so his own fate was kind of tied to the US's at that point.
Yeah. Should we move on to stage 3 real quick before we hit the end?
Yep.
So stage 3 is crisis. And he said this takes up to 6 weeks. And if you look at the like countries in Central and South America in the 80s and 90s that were going through massive upheaval and dictatorships and regime changes, you really start to see how like they were destabilized and then a quick crisis and then a change in government when they were often then aligned with socialism, communism, Soviet Union, right? So crisis, really quick stage, and then the last stage is an indefinite stage, and that is normalization. So that's the normalization of propaganda.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things here, what it normalizes is essentially confusion and tries to get rid of what's actually true, because by then people, I mean, like we see it now, a lot of people don't really believe in absolute truths, which we are going to be doing a podcast on, like the difference between an absolute truth and then a relative truth. And people can kind of just make up what's true for them. And here is kind of where I like to point out humor and like kind of why things are funny and why I think humor is so important. Because what humor does is something's only funny when it reveals a hidden truth. You know, I mean, I can't really think of too many examples where it doesn't talk about something that is actually true and kind of hidden, where it's like not funny. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you have
that's
have you seen something on that?
There has to be like a shred of truth in the joke for it to be funny.
And then what they kind of do is like bring it out essentially, and people are like laughing because they're like, "Huh, that's actually kind of true."
Yeah,
you know.
Another thing that Bezmenov said in about this last stage, this is a quote. He said, "What will happen if you allow the schmucks to promise people goodies and install benevolent dictators and remove the free market system?" That is normalization. So this is kind of the plight of democracy, is that it always tends to evolve in people realizing that they can vote themselves money with special interests and subsidies. And that's why I'm typically much more of like a libertarian and anti-subsidy and stuff like that. Because once people just fight to vote themselves money, then they just hurt everyone else. And that's like another driver of inflation, because things are artificially inflated in price because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking about this in my U.S. history class. It was whether lobbying is freedom of speech, because that's why lobbying's allowed, because people say it's freedom of speech. And the other day I was looking at the top lobbying industries. The top one is real estate, which is why the tax code is, or it was some sort of, I don't know if it's a super PAC or committee or whatever is donating to these politicians, but that's like the tax code is written to benefit people who buy property.
It's a classic Robert Kiyosaki quote. Tax code is written for the investor, for the real estate investor.
Yeah, and when you have tax rates, or like basically like the tax, like you get a tax breaks essentially, and that puts you at such an advantage because of compounding interest, like we've talked before. Like I don't know the exact percentage, but say you pay 10% less in tax on income compared to somebody who's just working like a regular job, you have a 10% advantage, and that compounds over the years and becomes a huge sum of money. And that's also how a lot of wealthy families keep wealth in the family, is by passing down properties and getting around the estate tax through trusts.
Yeah. Nick, do you have anything else for normalization here?
Also that when people try to vote themselves money, it doesn't always work, and they don't really care. People, I don't know, looking for politicians a lot of times will make false promises that don't come true, and then just promise it again, and like it doesn't happen, and just keep promising it, and it doesn't happen.
If people hear that they're getting free college enough times, they'll just think they're getting free college.
Yeah, I mean, and they even push through the loan forgiveness, and I mean, I haven't heard about. I mean, I heard about it very briefly, and haven't really heard too much about it since.
Yeah.
I think they were supposed to rule on it the end of June.
I thought it happened last fall. I thought the Supreme Court said they couldn't.
I think that was a Texas court.
Loans.
I think that was a Texas court, and I think it kept moving up the chain.
Okay.
And I think they were supposed to hear it at the end of June. So if it hasn't come out yet, it will be.
We'll have to look into that, see what happened.
Yeah, yeah. But no, that's all I have for normalization, I guess.
Yeah, and then like Nick was hitting on just a minute ago with Bezmenov's incentive for doing this. He said, like, I have to tell people what the KGB is trying to do to American culture because America is like the last stronghold of freedom. And it's like a ticking time bomb. If we lose our freedoms, there's nowhere to run to. You can't go to Russia. You can't go to China, right? So America is the last place that is supposed to be standing up for freedom. And if the culture shifts and people don't realize what they're doing and how they're being lied to, there's nowhere else to go.
Yep, that was well said.
All right. This is all we've got for the 4th of July Freedom episode, one of our 5Fs. If there's any certain 5F or any one of the Fs or any topic in specific you want us to do an episode on, make sure you reach out. I know we've had some interest in doing an episode on like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So we might do that as our next Freedom episode when we get to that.
Yep. All right. Yep. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us today at Weights and Wealth. And don't forget to apply today's lessons to live healthy and wealthy.
If this conversation will contribute to your fitness and financial gains, please share it with a friend or family member and give a 5-star review so more people can lift bigger weights and get bigger bank accounts.